Very sensitive story with a very sensitive ending to it, and I tell it infrequently and extremely cautious about the audience that I tell it to, especially with the younger ones here. And it's something that I have studied, and as an incurable teacher that I am, I chose the story very carefully. And I put it together very carefully with bits and pieces of the history that I know. The story lasts about 15 minutes and it comes in 3 parts. And it does appear to be a story about the mountain men, and it is. And it does appear to be a story about romance, and it is. Yes, romance. But it basically is a story about something that occurs in the last few minutes of this very short story. And you can see, when I get to that part of it, you'll see why I'm so cautious about telling this story and the audience that will be in front of me. And we've all had the experience of classrooms and reading books. And we come across this topic that I'm telling you is so sensitive. And we see that that's ink on a page. And we've had the experiences in classrooms, and some of them very, very well taught with talented history teachers in college or high school. And there are plenty of good ones. But yet, what they're doing is just education that is a kind of a statistical thing, and rarely is it emotional. When we see ink on a page, and we know that's information, but do we feel it? And we hear a lecture in a classroom, and we know that it's information, but do we feel it? And that's my job as a storyteller, just to add that particular part to this story. William Isaac was absolutely delighted to be in the legendary Missouri land here, leaving Virginia behind. What he left behind was his family, his mother long dead, and his inebriated father. He was glad to leave him. And here he was in the legendary Missouri land. Everything seemed so different, and so lucky he was to hire on with the Ashley group. Ashley's men. Here he was. And they took off on the rivers and the hills and the valleys towards the west. And along the way, he forged a friendship with another fellow, a dark-skinned fellow by the name of Jim Beckworth, along with Ashley and young Isaac. They were the same age and they had the same background, except one was the son of a slave. But they were the best of friends, and he was respected by all. As the days came and went, Ashley's their leader, and old Oscar was there. Yes, old Oscar was there. He was the one who had the knowledge of where they were going. He had been out west before, and he had explored and had close identities with the people there, the native peoples there. And on they went until they reached the point that old Oscar said, "Okay, men, look at that horizon." "Yeah, Oscar, looks like we got a cloud formation out there. Dark clouds of men in the Rocky Mountains." And here these eastern boys just, they're raw. And it wasn't long, too long, of course, but it wasn't long until they found themselves moving up slowly. They had to move up another step and another step. And then each step was a little cooler than the one before. And after several days of ascending, they looked back down to the prairie there, whence they had come, and they realized, were we down there? Have you ever had that experience and looked down over your shoulder from a rocky mountain? Well, they kept on going, of course, and they couldn't stop, and Oscar was really the source of really detailed information, more so than Mr. Ashley. Eventually they reached the place, and they looked around, and Oscar said, "Okay, this'll do it, men. This is where we're going to spend the winter." And they're feeling how cool it is now in midsummer. What's that going to be like? Only their worst nightmares could tell them. Well, they begin to construct a little cabin there, because you're not going to survive a Rocky Mountain winter in a tent. You don't do that. Oscar knew that. They made a little cabin then, and then they started working with the traps and bringing in firewood, working on this and working on that, which is toil every day. Toil. Until a few weeks later, Mr. Ashley called them in by the fire in the little cabin that they had built. dozen young fellows. He said, man, I'm so happy with you guys. You have really worked at this. You've never complained. Look at what we've accomplished. And you knew nothing about this. I'm going to do something I've never done with my group before. Tomorrow we're going to take a day off. And who doesn't like that? And they were quite astonished. And Isaac and Jim are always working together, and they looked at each other, a day off. And then Oscar said, I tell you what, tomorrow, right before dawn, I'm going to have the coffee going right out here. And anybody who wants to go to me, it's a day's hike. Anybody who wants to go with me, I'm going to go visit some of my friends. It's a day's hike. A good long day's hike. That's why I have to start so early. Anybody who wants to show up with me, you can go with me. Isaac and Jim looked at each other and nodded. Well, very early the next morning, it was still plenty cool and plenty dark out, and he had the fire going, and the coffee was bubbling, and they sat down, and he said, "Slam that coffee down, boy." Then it was Jim and Isaac, the only two. Slam that coffee down. Grab a piece of bread, we're heading down the trail. So down the trail they went, and of course they kind of get that conversation going, where are we going, Oscar? Where are you taking us? What is this all about? He said, just follow me and see. We're going to go see my Shoshone friends. Oh yeah? What's that? You ever heard the word Indian, said Oscar. Ooh, they understood that word. They got those in the East too. And they looked like, we're going to go see Indians. Don't worry, men, you're with me. Well, they were anyway. They kept on going down that trail, and about just a little bit before sunset, they saw smoke rising from the trees. They got closer and closer and closer and more nervous, and they saw those upturned conical dwellings that they had heard so much about and never really seen one, at least not before this moment. But old Oscar kept walking right in the path, right into the village, and there were these two young fellows right behind him. They were following along, looking from side to side. When are they going to jump us? When are they going to jump us? You can imagine what Eastern boys and their imagination would be telling them, Oscar was here, and he's still alive. Maybe we're okay too. And then Isaac looked to his left, and he saw a number of women over there, cross-legged around, looked like a good-sized elk hide, and they were just scraping in and scraping, and they quit scraping in and scraping to look up at these funny-looking guys, a brown one, a white one, and a white-whiskered guy named Oscar. They knew Oscar. And then Isaac's eyes stopped. He did not know that his life was going to change in about 1 second. His eyes stopped on the most gorgeous thing he had ever seen. And she rose to her knees from her cross-legged position, and the two of them, their eyes met like this. And he kept on walking, and they just couldn't take their eyes off of each other. And all of a sudden he felt something tugging at his elbow. He said, come on, you be good, come on, let's go. He didn't want to go, but he did. And of course, Oscar had introduced his two young friends to the village elders, and there were many embraces and talk of old times in that language. Of course, Jim and Isaac had no idea what they were saying. And that night there was a kind of a celebratory thing that typically the Plains and natives do, and for visitors, for special visitors. There was a fire, there was great feasting, a lot of laughter. And then one of them stood and sang. And behind her was the fire, so all that Isaac could see was this dark silhouette and that voice that had him feeling like he was floating. Yes, it was Chana, as he came to nickname her, Chana. He couldn't pronounce her real Shoshone name. It was her key. Well, that night, they spent the night, all three of them spent the night under a very special aspen tree there. And the next morning, there was conversations between the elders and of course Oscar, and he said, come on, we got to go, man. We don't want to wear our welcome But these are old friends. They really are. So they followed the same path out of there, and standing right to the right there was Chanda. Didn't pronounce her name, and he stopped. He dared to stop this time. Now they were eyeball to eyeball. He felt that push. Jim was pushing him. And she raised her hand, and he touched it. And that was what really changed his life. He touched Chanda. Well, they kept on going. They knew that he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay there forever. But on he went. We've all had these experiences when we were adolescents, have we? Well, this is what was happening, and it was what we call today cross-cultural. An ocean of difference between the two. Well, they made it back to the camp, and all the drudgery of the traps and the firewood and all of these things, and Isaac and Jim were always shoulder to shoulder working, and after a couple of days of that, Jim looked at Isaac and said, "Man, your brain is elsewhere." He would try to swing an axe and miss. There's a zillion things. He said, "Isaac, tomorrow morning before dawn, just go. Don't ask him Mr. Ashley's permission. He's a good guy. He'll forgive you, and I'll do your work. Take a couple days. But me, just me, they're Indians. Go. If you don't go, you'll never know." He dared to do it. Such is love. Right before dawn the next morning, Isaac was down that path. He put one step in front of another, watching the sun rise closer and closer now, on towards the end of the day, and getting closer now. I was just beating. Part of it was fear at this time. He's going to be entering a Shoshone village without Oscar to lead the way. But he kept on going, and there she was, sitting cross-legged around that same elk hide. And she stood and walked towards him, and he could hear the giggles of the other older women there as they were sitting. She gestured, and he followed her over under that same aspen tree where they had slept a few days before. And they attempted to converse, trying to penetrate a language barrier that would seem to be impenetrable. He first thought, well, I'll teach her a word for tree relief or whatever. Then he stopped himself and said, I don't want her to know anything about us. I don't want to adulterate her culture and what she is. I want to know about her. I want to become her. So we started learning first this word and that word, and this word and that word, and this word and that word. And his bad pronunciation would produce some very, very welcome humor between the two. And that evening, she gestured to join the family, and he was treated like a lost friend. Well, he was invited to stay in one of these upturned conical dwellings we call today teepees. And there were some other young fellows in there about his age, and they treated him well. I couldn't understand a word he said. The next day, back under the aspen tree, walking about the village, side by side, not hand in hand, not yet. Another night, and then another day. Now he's in his third day thinking about Jim back in the drudgery that they were enduring. So he had to go. He was yet to touch her again, and on his way out, they touched, and that was all. And he left. Well, of course, the leaves are starting to turn now, and the winters came, and they came with a ferocity that they had never seen before. And the darkness and the deep cold of all that impenetrable cold of the wintertime, that all Isaac had to do was close his eyes, and he could see that gorgeous thing before him in her eyes. And that was his escape. But the blizzards kept coming, and the seemed to be eternal. But then came the spring. It always does. The springtime came, and the first nice day, Isaac approached Mr. Ashley, and he said, Mr. Ashley, and Mr. Ashley said, I know. Just come. So Mr. Ashley said, but if you don't stay with us, I can't pay you a wage. He said, Mr. Ashley, I don't need a wage. So he took off down that path, saying goodbye, hopefully just temporarily, to his old friend Jim. And he made it down that path, and they greeted each other with an embrace that night. He and China, they were now embracing, they were actually embracing. And they were with each other constantly, doing chores, as if they were old friends. They were more than old friends. They wanted more and more. And then later on in the summer, there was a ceremony, and they crossed over, and she was his, and he was hers. And they were assigned their own dwelling there, their own dwelling. And his life was beginning now. How exciting! What else could a dream come true? How could he go there? And he was every day. He was a little more Shoshone, a little more Shoshone. Another word, another custom, another idea, anything abstract notions about life here and there. He was a little more Shoshone every day. And then she was with child. It came, of course. She said, we don't name them now, we name them later, and this will come. And their joy could not be even described. And another year came, and then another. And now she is with child again. Their joy was greater and greater and greater, as was the pride of the village. One morning, about mid-morning, Isaac emerged from their dwelling. He was smelling the sweet smell of the smoke of the cook fires. And he looked to his left, and here came Jim. Jim came down the path there. He was not looking from side to side. He was not returning greetings of any kind. His eyes were fixed on Isaac, and he approached him without saying a word. He'd never seen Jim look quite like this. And he approached him even closer, and he put his hands on either shoulder of his old friend, and he said, Isaac! The box is here. The box. Of course. He knew. He had seen it happen in the East, back in Virginia, and others, the native people and other people who recently arrived from every parts of the world. They had seen the pustules in their skin, and how they died slowly, and they suffered. That box is here. It can't be. It is. Isaac, have any of your young hunters hunted over the hills there towards the northwest, toward that other Shoshone village? Because, you see, Jim had also begun living with natives of another culture. And Isaac said, oh, yes, I believe. Those two over there, yes, they just got back. He called them over, and he asked them, have you seen any of the hunters? He asked those two boys, have you seen any of the hunters of the other Shoshone village in that direction? And the two boys asked, yes, we always see them. We hunt together. Did you enter the village? And the boy said, no, not this time. They didn't want us to. There was something strange about their denial. Not permitted or invited to come into the village. Something was wrong there. In a very few days, those two Shoshone boys were about sick as sick can be. And it wasn't 2, it was 4 who were about as sick can be. And it wasn't 4, it was more and more. And what could possibly be causing it? What is descended upon us? Why did it here? And more and more and more. And then it was time for it to visit Jonah's dwelling and Isaac's, the little one and the one yet to be born. Realized at this point that instead of smelling the cook fires of the morning and the laughter of the children as he was hearing the moans of the dying, and the odor of the dead, and he knelt down next to that fire and he felt the warmth of the little one waning, and he realized that she had been gone for a while. Placed his heart on Chana's chest. He felt her breathe no more. And the pain, agony of the pustules can no longer make her suffer. That night, he stepped outside and he looked up at that night sky and the low-hanging clouds, and the drizzle that mixed with the tears in his face. And he raised his hands and looked up. And he went to what he could not understand. And he said, "O evil one of the night, by what right do you destroy these beautiful people? By what right? And why?" The dawn was joyless, gray, and dead. The village was silent. And he buried all 3 of them and covered them over. And then he wept until his body shook. And of course, Jim was there, like he always was. And they looked at each other, and they just shook their heads without words and asked each other without words, "Why?" They walked through, the 2 of them, when they walked through that silent village, and out the other side with no particular purpose to their lives. But they had each other. And they walked kind of aimlessly over the hills and up around the old creekway that where they used to hunt, and on they went towards the west, not really wandering or thinking or talking. And then they sat by a fire after a few days. They finally spoke. Jim asked Isaac, "Do you know why this has happened?" He simply looked at his old friend. That's all he did. He just looked at him. Until this day, do any of us have an answer to such a thing? Thank you.
Thank you.
I hesitate to add something statistical after that. It's not a statistical story, as you can see. You can see why I was so sensitive about and careful about telling such a story. I came across the data a while back in my reading about this phenomenon of the diseases. I imagine some of you have seen the statistic I'm going to mention. It's not just a number. 90% seen that? The death rate of the Native Americans, 90%. When I saw that number, it can't possibly be right, and I kept coming across that again, that corroborated again, and again, and again. Can you imagine such a thing?